Lucy Komisar, you are one of the foremost observers and reporters and just insider minds on the issue of Wall Street financial crime and particularly naked short selling. Please just tell us in a couple of minutes about your background with this enormously important issue that is at the heart of why America is failing economically.
It started with my understanding of offshore, and I didn't know anything about that, and I'll explain that in a minute. I was in the 80s, early 90s, doing foreign reporting, and I went to places like the Philippines and Zaire, when it was called Zaire, and Haiti, and I was talking to the democratic oppositions, because those places were all run by dictators. And each of them, and we're talking about different continents, we're talking about Asia and Africa and Latin America. Each of them said to me, the dictator has looted the country and put the money in Swiss banks. Now, I didn't know anything about Swiss banks. I'd probably seen some movies where some gangsters had Swiss bank accounts, but you don't think that much about it. And I thought, these are people in different continents. They're telling me they put the money offshore in Switzerland. I better find out about that. So I began to look into offshore and into Switzerland. Well, I found out it wasn't only Switzerland. It was all over the world. And it wasn't just Swiss banks. A lot of UK and US and French and German banks, they had subsidiaries in offshore places. Now, what is offshore? Offshore is, maybe it's in Switzerland or Grand Cayman or Luxembourg or the Isle of Man. It's where you could have a secret bank account and a secret company which is not listed in your name. And it's not just, they joke about sunny isles with shady people. Well, in the US, in Delaware, in Montana, you can get a company registration without your real name. And a lot of these places that I mentioned, such as Grand Cayman, the Isle of Man, those are British protectorates. The UK has some influence there, but of course, the City of London, the place where business is done, they use these places. And they use them for legal purposes, that is to evade taxes. I think evading taxes should not be legal, but it's legal. But there are some people that use it for very nefarious purposes, for scamming. And the American companies, the shell companies, they're called shell because there's nothing in there, it's a shell, or they're called letterbox companies because you can find an office building in Delaware with 1,000 companies in that little office building. It's just a letterbox. These are used because people in other countries may say, oh, this must be a legitimate company. It's an American company. Well, if it's in Delaware or Montana, maybe not. So that is what offshore is. And I began to write a lot about offshore over 20 years ago. And then a number of years ago, I got a contact from somebody who was involved in a movie that was going to be made about naked short selling. And the person contacted me and I said, I never heard of naked short selling. I don't think I'm your person to talk about this. And he said, no, we want you to talk about offshore because you are an expert in that. And that was true. Offshore is one of the nefarious things that people use offshore companies and accounts for is illegal naked short selling. And that's how I got into that. That's how I met some of the other people that you've been interviewing. I met them at the filming a number of years ago, and where I talked about offshore. So there is a real connection, and that's what I want to talk about today, because this is a crooked use of offshore, and it hurts particularly small businesses, small companies, and the small companies, it said over and over again, give the most jobs in this country to workers, employees. Well, these companies are they are to have been destroyed by naked short selling enabled by offshore. And so that is the connection. And that's why politicians need to care about this. If they care about small business and the people that are employed there, they have to be aware of naked short selling, how it kills those businesses, and they need to know that the offshore system, which is facilitated by the big banks, is responsible for part of the existence of this system.
You know, I completely agree with you. And one of the things I'm working to do is connect William Binney, the National Security Agency Technical Director, with William Barr, the Attorney General, because we have all the offshore accounts. They're in the NSA databases. But because the Senate Banking Committee and previous departments of justice have been bribed by Wall Street or blackmailed in some instances, they have been not allowing the US government to use its capabilities to actually go against white collar crime, which I think is a scourge. Now, you have a Sedona story for us. You have a case study.
This is fascinating. It should be a movie because this connects offshore and naked short selling. So this is the story. Two brothers from Austria, Andreas and Thomas Badian, came from Vienna in the late 1990s and set up a financial operation in New York. Badian was then 30, and he had worked for Jessup. When he first got here, he worked for Jessup and Lamont, which is a New York brokerage and investment banking firm. And he met a man named Michael Vasinkovich. Now, Vasinkovich had been running pipe deals. Pipe means private investment in public equity. And what that means is if you don't want to go and sell stock on the stock exchange, but you need money and you don't want to just take a direct loan from a bank, this is in between. You make a deal where you get a loan, and what the lender gets is the right in a number of years, in a specified period, to buy shares of stock at X number of shares of stock. Now, what happens is you think, well, I'm doing well in the company and they will buy the stock, and probably the stock price will maybe be about the same as it is now. And if we're doing well, the stock price may even go up. What they do in these pipe deals is they use naked short selling to knock down the price of the stock. So when they come in for their right to buy the stock, they get a lot of stock for practically nothing. And then the next time they are allowed to buy more stock, they could take over the company for practically nothing. And that's what these pipe deals do. So
let me just intervene and make a quick point, because my research has found that the placement companies are co-conspirators with the naked short sellers. So
Yes.
the people that you go to, H.C. Wainwright comes to mind, are companies that will leak the placement, and then the naked short selling cycle starts.
Yes. What happened was that Vasinkovich then moved to a New York investment firm, Ladenburg Thalmann, very old firm. And Badian, the brothers set up Rhino Advisors in New York to collaborate with Vasinkovich. And so there was Badian, who was about 30, and his brother Andreas was 26. And they were introduced as investment advisors for clients who would go through Vasinkovich. And they would run naked short selling scams connected to offshore shell companies. Everything went through offshore, the British Virgin Islands, Panama, Zurich, Liechtenstein, all of that.
Now, I understand Mark Valentine had 2,000 offshore accounts, and he would use them as a shell game, so that if he was forced to buy in on something, he would then just magically produce 1 million counterfeit shares from another offshore company. And so it's a constantly rotating shell game.
So why offshore? So they were investment advisors. So they're supposed to be getting investors, and they're introduced to the people from Sedona, which is a software company in Pennsylvania. And we're going to find you investors. Why do you want to use offshore? Because it's really their companies, but you don't know because it's not their name. They cover up the real owners, and the SEC has rules for reporting ownership, but they don't require the identification of people behind these firms. So the owners are fake. The Badians managed funds for 2 overseas clients, which they really owned. They were Creon Management, which was based in the British Virgin Islands, BVI, and Amro International, registered in Panama and based in Zurich, all offshore. So Vasinkovich worked with a man named Herbert Batliner, a prominent fraudster in Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein might say there's a joke that Swiss bankers go to Liechtenstein to hide their money because it is so secret and so dirty. The U.S. prosecutors, I discovered, had told a Colorado federal court that Batliner, this same man, handled money for a drug dealer who was then serving a prison sentence in Ecuador. So these partners struck at Sedona, this software firm. Vasinkovich of Ladenburg Thalmann contacted Sedona in 1999 with the promise of money. It would locate investors and sell shares through private placement. There's your private placement, PIPE, private investment in public equity. His investor was the Rhino Batliner Group. Sedona agreed to the proposition because they trusted the reputation of Ladenburg Thalmann. So Rhino, in November 2000, lent Sedona $2.5 million. That would be converted into shares worth $3 million about a year later. And the money they received was channeled through fake offshore investment firms that the Badians controlled. Now, the contract with AMRO said no shorting because that would push down the share price, and the less the stock was worth when it came time to convert the loan, the more of the stock the investors would get. They were getting $3 million worth of shares when they converted. Well, if the stock price has gone down a huge amount, like 50%, you get twice as many shares for that $3 million. This is called a death spiral scheme because the financiers promise a large line of credit in exchange for convertible securities, which can in future be converted into shares of common stock. And the more the stock goes down, the more shares the owner of the convertible security can claim at the time they're converting. So Sedona officials never wondered why Rhino's investors, AMRO International, was a triple layered offshore entity. Layering is a favorite tactic. You have the company set up here in this one offshore place. You have a bank account set up there. You have a company, the company owned by another offshore company. Triple layering is very popular. So this was set up in Panama. The company was Panama. But it was headquartered in Zurich, Switzerland, and it was financed through Liechtenstein, all prominent tax havens. So the Sedona stock price started at $6. It would fall to 20 cents. Even as the company announced deals with places like IBM and other companies, and you would think that would boost the stock price. We got a deal with IBM. No. Why? Because with his confederates, Andreas Badian started naked shorting the stock, increasing the shares in the market and therefore depressing the price. The loan would have to be paid back with many more shares, giving the Badians control of the firm. Two of his confederates worked for Refco, which was the largest broker on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So these are not little fly-by-night companies. And its CEO would go to jail on another scam. Now, Andreas Badian was thrilled when he learned that the stock had fallen below $1. How do we know this? Because at a certain point, the SEC started bugging his phone. He phoned his confederates with directions to keep selling and use unbridled levels of aggression because every dollar that you sell is a dollar in my pocket. So Sedona one day received, and they won't say who sent it to them, a 300-page ring binder with analyses of 60 companies that were destroyed by Rhino, Batliner, and similar operations. So Sedona finally started smelling a rat. And the next time Badian demanded a conversion, Sedona refused. Badian filed suit. Sedona then countered with subpoenas that would have revealed the naked short selling scam. And within a week, Badian withdrew the suit and he agreed not to ask for any more stock. Now, in 2003, Sedona hired Houston lawyer Wes Christian, who you have interviewed, and is a major person in fighting these naked short selling scams. And Wes Christian filed civil action against Ladenburg Thalmann, Vasinkovich, Bodian, Rhino, and others. That the lawsuit was in U.S. federal court in New York. And it said that these defendants had run the same death spiral scam against at least 21 U.S. companies from 1998 through 2000. The firms either went bankrupt or their shares were knocked down to pennies. And when your shares at pennies, you can't sell stock and you can't get loans. And among those companies were Viragen, a biopharmaceutical company, and Calypto Biomedical Corporation, which developed medical screening tests. Both companies, we would like to have them now instead of having them been destroyed. So Sedona went to the SEC and the Justice Department. The SEC got those tapes. The SEC in February 2003 filed a complaint against Thomas Bodian and his company Rhino for fraud and market manipulation of the Sedona shares. Bodian and Rhino immediately settled with the SEC for $1 million without admitting or denying guilt. Now, the SEC, can only bring civil suits. They can't put people in prison. The Justice Department is supposed to put crooks in prison.
Right, and just to make 2 points. Number one, the $1 million fine that they paid for was a tiny fraction of the money they had stolen.
Yes.
And number two, the two life-saving companies you talked about before, basically in destroying companies, they're destroying life-saving innovations that help the public.
And so then the SEC filed a case against Andreas. After years of delays, it was scheduled for hearing in New York federal court in 2013. But before the court date, Andreas settled for $450,000. Again, the cost of doing business. The Justice Department filed criminal charges against Thomas, but he fled to Vienna. And there's no agreement for moving prisoners from the U.S. doesn't have an agreement with Austria, where you can get prisoners who have done egregious wrong. So Austria, which, by the way, it brags about its bank and corporate secrecy. It has no extradition treaty. And the Department of Justice dropped its criminal case against Andreas altogether. It won't say why. So these crooks paid small change and they destroyed companies. So why do these fraudsters use offshore? And again, Wes Christian is very good at explaining it because he's done these cases. He said, it's done that way because in the US, if you have 5% interest in a company, you have to report it. So with these pipe deals, they come in with 3 different companies, 3 different names. So the shares won't go above 5%. And most of them are companies developed for a couple of deals, and then they kill off the companies. Now, of course, Ladenburg Thalmann, they knew what was going on. They were introducing the investors, right? Wait till you see what happens to them. I'll give you a hint, nothing. Christian said Batliner was there to launder the money, to take the dirty money from Liechtenstein, which also works for drug traffickers. We know Batliner was working for a drug trafficker. Take that dirty money, turn it into clean money, so it could be lent to companies through the pipe deals. And Wes Christian pointed out, Amro is located in Zurich. Switzerland is now a conduit to Liechtenstein. It's the last place for secret banking. Now, he said the lawsuits, and he's done quite a few of them, like more than 20, I think, show that the illegal shorters use shell companies in offshore Guernsey, the Caymans, Costa Rica, the Isle of Man, Nevis, Curacao, the Netherlands, Antilles, the Bahamas, and Liechtenstein. And that the Bodian Group did 40 different equity loans, promising $1 billion altogether to these various companies, and the Bodians put the companies all out of business. So Christian and the lawyers cooperating with him on naked short selling found more than 1,200 hedge funds and offshore accounts working through more than 150 U.S. broker-dealers to strip small and medium-sized public companies of their value. Now, the U.S. government, however, chooses to go after the low-hanging fruit. The Bodians. Thomas Bodian fled to Austria. The feds never got him. There's still a warrant out on him, but they had the goods on the stock clearing firm. The broker-dealers, they dropped them. and their tactics were helped by the SEC, which, in the name of globalization, has opened the markets to offshore brokers and hedge funds without realizing they would never be able to monitor their activities or regulate their conduct. So individuals set up offshore funds without providing identification. They're hidden. They're protected through layers of shell companies and trusts. They use nominee firms. The owners finesse the rules requiring ownership of 5%. They gain complete control secretly of public companies, or they bleed it of all the liquid assets before they bankrupt it. According to the Sedona lawsuit, during Vasinkovich's tenure, the investment company and Bodian were involved in other death spiral deals that drove companies into the ground. In 1999, the stock of Wave Rider Communications went from $15.84 to a penny. AmeriQuest Technologies in 2000 saw the shares go from 50 cents to 1/100th of a penny. The investors of both cases were shell companies run by Batliner. Batliner, by the way, is an interesting character. He once was, to tell you how dirty the place is, he was the head of the Liechtenstein Supreme Court. And he gave over $1 billion worth of paintings to a state museum in Vienna. And he's quoted in an article that was printed in the press about this great donation as saying, "You can never have too many Picassos." And that's Batliner, who is operating. Now, Christian said to me, every company that came to Michael Vasinkovich is out of business or has stock at a penny. And, he's a Texan. He says, you tell me, if it moves, has an udder, as we say in Texas, it's a cow. I think he's trying to say, if you do crooked things, you're a crook. And so this is, that's the Sedona story. It's a cautionary tale, and it ought to be a tale that provides a lesson to people dealing with financial operations in the United States.
Now, let me ask you this, because before we get to the moral of the story, it seems to me that Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, JP Morgan, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, and UBS are the big dogs in both naked short selling and in money laundering. And that's really cool because we've identified $200 trillion in illicit assets that could be confiscated under civil and criminal forfeiture because you can directly trace them between NSA and a DTCC audit and then subpoenas. So why is no one going after Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, and JP Morgan, just to take three prominent names?
Because they give a lot of money to campaigns. They, especially now that we have the Supreme Court saying you can have limitations on contributions. They do it through their companies. They can do it through, they set up special accounts, which maybe don't have a candidate's name on it, but that's who it goes to. Their executives who are being paid multi-millions give money. There's no control anymore after Citizens United. And these people, if you look at, they do have to, if it's the name of a company, very often, or an individual has to register the name. The candidate has to register where they're getting the money from. Well, look at all the money that's coming from the Goldmans and the JP Morgans. They're buying the Congress. And that's why the Congress doesn't act on this. There was, for years, until he retired, Carl Levin, who was a senator from Michigan. And he held a dozen hearings showing how Citibank was a crook and how they all were crooked. And he tried to get legislation passed just having the name of the real owner of the company. You do have to do that for bank accounts, except if the bank account is owned by a shell company, then you got a fake owner. He could not get that through Congress. There are still some people trying on this, but they haven't been able to get it through America's crooked Congress.
Well, I completely agree with you, and I've been holding the Senate Banking Committee, and particularly past Senator Dodd and current Senators Shelby and Blumenthal as accountable for allowing these crimes to continue with the blessing of the Senate Banking Committee. So let's end the moral of the story. Now, Donald Trump has just hit a hole-in-one. He's in a good mood. He turns to you, he says, Lucy, what's the moral? What should I do, particularly now that I'm putting people in jail for rioting in the streets? Is there a tough on Wall Street card that I can play?
Well, there's one really easy one. The U.S. has to ban anonymous investments in U.S. companies, and not just over 5%. Absolutely no anonymous companies. You have to know who are the investors. It has to know the identity of the owners of the offshore companies that invest in the U.S., including their links to other offshore companies, because we get into this layering system where A is owned by B, which is owned by C, and their headquarters are in D, and who knows where the money is in some Swiss vault. And they have to ban naked short selling. Supposedly they do, but it's not enforced. The SEC is really partners with some of these people, and there's a revolving door. People go from the law firms that are handling this for the banks, and they go into the SEC, and then they turn around and they go back to law firms where they're getting big bucks. And they have to put people in jail, not just fine them a little bit of money, which is just the cost of doing business. Anything that's a few million is the cost of doing business. They have to go to jail. That will seriously focus the minds of the executives who are doing this. And
please, let me interrupt with two quick comments. First off, I'd like to point out that it was Eric Holder of Covington, the same firm that threw General Flynn under the bus and cheated him out of $3 million. It was Eric Holder who wrote the Holder Memorandum that took jail off the table under Obama for Wall Street crime. The second thing I'd like to point out is that banks appear now to be running portfolio accounts in order to specifically disconnect the individual traders from the crime. And I think we need to actually put the name of the trader on every crime. It's funny how trader sounds like traitor. There's a real synchronicity there. So any last words from you? And what I think has been
I think in the end, the U.S. should block the offshore system, because that exists to facilitate fraud, either by tax evasion or by helping the kind of scams and schemes that I was talking about. For example, the U.S. now can ban, on grounds of national security, bank transfers from Iran, North Korea, Syria, because those transfers are considered facilitators of terrorism. Well, I believe that the offshore system that allows crooks to destroy American companies is also committing terrorism. I believe that Robert Morgenthau was a great district attorney in New York for about 30 years. And I once interviewed him on this subject. He said, Lucy, it is really easy. You just say that a bank in Grand Cayman cannot have access to the American financial system unless it has the real names of the owners of the accounts and the companies there, and that they are available to law enforcement readily, quickly. And he said, do you know how many people would put their money in Grand Cayman if they couldn't move it into New York? Nobody. That's the way. The U.S. can do it right now. The president does not need an act of Congress. The president already has the right to have the U.S. Treasury ban transfers from banks in any location on grounds that these banks are harmful to the United States. They are promoting terrorism in the United States, and it is financial terrorism. And that's what he ought to do. He ought to ban offshore accounts from moving money into the U.S. unless there's no more bank and corporate secrecy in those jurisdictions. I would like him to do that.
Let's stop there. That is a brilliant ending to what has been an extraordinarily informative, educational, public service announcement by you. Thank you so very much.
It's my pleasure.